Welcome to Heritage Events Live. My name is Emily Gao, and I'm the director of the DeVos Center for Religion and Civil Society at the Heritage Foundation. Today's event is Religion is Essential, COVID Lockdowns and Unjust Religious Discrimination. On the eve of Thanksgiving last year, attorneys from the Becket Fund for Religious Liberty won an important victory at the Supreme Court on behalf of religious liberty. Agudath Israel, an Orthodox Jewish advocacy organization, and the Roman Catholic Diocese of Brooklyn, New York, sued to stop Governor Andrew Cuomo from enforcing caps on religious gatherings, limiting them to as few as 10 people. In his concurrence in the decision, Justice Neil Gorsuch wrote, "The only explanation for treating religious places differently during a pandemic seems to be a judgment that what happens there just isn't as essential as what happens in secular spaces. And that is exactly the kind of discrimination that the First Amendment forbids. And yet, many states and local authorities have treated religious services as they are not as essential as liquor stores, casinos, and cannabis dispensaries." Another judge called religious services soul-sustaining operations and asked why they could not be open in the same way as life-sustaining operations if they followed all of the same public health guidelines. Here to discuss these important questions and what we can do are Reverend Garry Leist, pastor of Calvary Chapel, Dayton Valley in Nevada; Rabbi Chaim David Zwiebel, executive vice president of Agudath Israel of America; Matt Sharp, senior counsel, state government relations, national director of Alliance Defending Freedom; and our special guest moderator, Kathryn Lopez, senior fellow at the National Review Institute and editor-at-large at National Review. And now I'd like to invite Reverend Leist to join us on screen for his remarks.
Good morning. It was spring of 2020 in Northern Nevada, and we were looking forward to what was going to be a great year. The church was growing, and we had plans on the drawing board of a 10,000 square foot expansion. The Lord has blessed Calvary Chapel greatly over the past 15 years, and what started out as a small Bible study of 6 to 8 people has grown into a healthy body of believers numbering around 400. Our great enthusiasm, however, was soon confronted by something none of us could have imagined. In mid-March, we were introduced to a new virus, unlike anything that our country had ever experienced. And from the very beginning, we watched with great concern as our leaders fought to get a handle on what was soon to be a global pandemic. Based on the guidelines from our president, we decided to shut down for 2 weeks to flatten the curve. And in mid-March, we suspended all in-person services and went to live stream only. I remember telling folks, oh, it's only going to be a couple of weeks and we'll be back in fellowship. Well, little did we know what was supposed to be 2 weeks would be followed by a series of open-ended orders from Nevada's governor. And with newfound power, he ordered the closure and restrictions as never seen before. The media added to what had become, well, mass hysteria as medical experts and government officials all argued over what needed to be done and who was in charge. At this time, we started to see the virus brought an evil beyond the physical threat, and this evil was the promotion of fear used to further what could be nothing less than an all-out assault on churches. As weeks turned to months, it became clear the members of the church were suffering greatly, not from the virus, but from the separation of fellowship and spiritual encouragement. And try as we may, church over the internet did not allow for the personal spiritual exchange and encouragement that's vital to life. The people were becoming sick. They were becoming sick spiritually, mentally, emotionally, and at times physically. The government's promotion of isolation through stay-at-home orders were creating more problems than they were solving. The isolation and sense of hopelessness that had accompanied it was having a devastating toll on people, and we saw a sharp increase in marital issues, leading to the brink of divorce for many. Problems started to arise amongst the children and the youth as their world was being filled with fear. Families were forced to break all ties with loved ones outside of their homes, and older members of our congregation, especially those who lived alone, were suddenly shut-ins, losing all personal contact with the outside world. The essential things that people need in their lives to provide for the spiritual, mental, emotional, and physical well-being were behind the closed doors of the church. In May, there seemed to be some light at the end of the tunnel. The governor announced that he was opening parts of the state at 50%. But we were shocked when we saw that casinos could open with thousands of people, but churches were limited to 50, regardless of the size. We were told that a violation of this order could result in civil and even criminal penalties. And at this time, along with some 200 other churches in Nevada, we sent a letter to the governor. We asked him to loosen these restrictions on the churches. We asked him to allow us to minister to the needs of our communities, just as churches have done throughout history. Unfortunately, our letter fell on deaf ears. At this time, we had no other choice but to seek legal assistance and to fight what we saw as open discrimination against the church. And we engaged ADF in order to protect our rights to assemble and to follow our biblical beliefs concerning the worship of God. And with the help of ADF, we went to court in May. We hoped for an injunction that would allow us the same treatment as casinos, but unfortunately, we're denied. And as most of you know, we took that denial all the way to the Supreme Court. Over the last 8 months or so, we have seen the case move up and down the line of courts without any relief until recently. Recently, we received a favorable ruling from the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, and we're pleased. We're pleased with the ruling that provides not only a victory for our church, but churches throughout the country. And while we wish the Supreme Court would have taken the case and broadened legal protections nationwide, what we have seen is nothing less than extraordinary. With the church free to exercise its God-given right to worship, people once again are being positively impacted. They have hope in their lives. And we may never know just how devastating the effect of closing churches has been on our country and on the world. Broken marriages and families, drugs and alcohol being abused, suicide, damage to kids who saw the removal of God as essential from life are yet untold. Our prayer going forward is that the government leaders will recognize the worship of God is essential, and that churches provide much more to the community than just a place to gather for an activity. It is in the church that people come to worship the Creator God of the universe and find hope in the salvation through His Son, Jesus Christ. It's in the church and the worship of God that people are made well. You see, the church is the place where people find spiritual, mental, emotional, and physical healing. I want to thank you today for the privilege and the honor it is to be able to share with you. And I'd like to now go ahead and turn things back over to Kathryn. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Pastor Leist, for your ministry and for your witness to religious liberty. This is a time where we're really facing, as you said, two pandemics. One of them spiritual, and it's so important that you're standing up for religious liberty, and so we thank you, and we thank you for the people you minister to. Now I'd like to welcome to the screen Rabbi Zwiebel and Matt Sharp.
Thank you so very much. And I very much appreciate this opportunity that Heritage Foundation is affording to me and to my fellow panelists to discuss an issue which I think really is at the very pinnacle of the challenges amongst all the many other challenges, but at the very pinnacle from our perspective, the challenge created in the era of COVID. I was very moved to hear Pastor Leist's remarks, which were, I think, although they represent a faith different than my own, obviously, but nonetheless, there were commonalities in the themes that were established by Pastor in his remarks, and the experiences that our community, the Orthodox Jewish community, particularly in New York, subject to the executive order issued by Governor Andrew Cuomo, felt, and the impact that it had on our people. You know, we speak as lawyers about the legal standards that apply in cases like this, and the authority that the governors of different states have to issue these things. And there are lots of lawyers can talk at great length about what this is all about. But at the end of the day, it boils down to the question of, do we appreciate what religion means to our community, to our society? At the end of the day, that's really what it's all about. And sadly, I've been with Agudath Israel now for 37 years. And I remember when I started working for Agudath Israel, which is a national Orthodox Jewish advocacy organization, the notion that that religious values were important in society and protection for religious activities was an important part. It was the bedrock founding principle of you know why this country was founded. The Pilgrims came here to establish religious freedom and to enjoy religious freedom, and that was kind of a given. But society appears over the years to have been moving in a direction where the secularization of the society around us, certainly of the world around us, but even here in the United States, which remains a religious country, but nonetheless, the trends have been moving in a direction where religion today is seen as the enemy of all that is good and fine and wonderful. So of course, it would not be perceived as essential that we in certain circles that religious people ought to have an opportunity to get together and do whatever it is that they do in their churches or mosques or synagogues, as the case may be. And that's a very frightening development and trend in the broader society. So I think that the fact that the Supreme Court of the United States, and then subsequently the US Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit in our case, made clear that in fact, religion is something which is essential, certainly no less essential than some of the other things that were deemed essential by Governor Cuomo. Bicycle shops, liquor stores, acupuncture facilities, all of these sorts of things were essential. And yet, and as many people as would come into the center where they were administering the acupuncture or were selling the booze or whatever else, there would be no limitations on the number of people who could be in the room at the time. And yet, if you come into your synagogue or to your church or mosque, you couldn't have more than 10 people. That's just, you know, again, a symbol of the denigration of the value of religion in our society. So to the extent that we struck a blow for the bedrock fundamental principle of religious freedom in the United States, this was a very important case. And in particular, I was very pleased that something that the district court had said in ruling against us, the court said that it's no big deal. Your congregants, Agudath Israel, can continue to observe their religion, but there will have to be modifications. Well, when the courts start telling us there will have to be modifications, then they're telling us that we can't be the ones who decide what it is that God Almighty expects of us, wants of us, but instead, of course, we have to bow our heads to the determination of what the secular government says the adequate practice of religion is. That's totally unacceptable, and I'm delighted that the Second Circuit Court of Appeals now has rejected that very explicitly, and I think that is a very valuable takeaway that can have strong influence on our society as we move forward.
Thank you, Rabbi. You are a personal hero of mine for what you've done here, because it's essential, and it's hurt people that churches and mosques and synagogues have had to have these arbitrary limits, and so it's, I think, and it's so important for legality, you know, obviously for the law and for the truth. But it also, you know, this is a cultural problem if we don't say this is wrong, you know. And, you know, in a Catholic context, there was a period where you could only have 10 people in St. Patrick's Cathedral. That's insane. You know, there's so much space. So anyhow, thank you for what you're doing. And we'll talk to you a little bit more. Matt, will you talk a little bit about this experience?
Yeah, so I wanted to give a little overview of how we ended up where we're at, especially with the legal battles that led to all of this. So when all of this first started, not quite a year ago, we saw what we kind of called the first wave of restrictions on churches. We saw some cities saying you could not have drive-in services. We saw others that even said, we're not even going to allow you have enough people on site to be able to do a webinar or a Facebook Live event or something like that, such that churches were completely shut out. Houses of worship were completely shut out from being able to meet together or to minister to their congregations, to their flocks in any meaningful way. So there was a lot of demand letters that ADF and other allies like Beckett Fund sent out, and some lawsuits, and we got a lot of those resolved. Well, then we saw a second wave where we're now at, and these came up in the context of what we see going on in California, where there are complete in-person bans on worshiping together indoors. Places like Nevada, where, as we talked about with Pastor Leist, casinos were allowed to be up to 50%, hundreds, thousands of people allowed in, but churches were limited to 50. And even places like Oregon, where religious schools were told that they were subject to limits that their public school counterparts were not. And so we've seen a lot of these efforts that all go back to how much can the government restrict the ability of religious organizations to do what is essential, to be able to minister, to be able to teach, to be able to gather together for that communal worship experience that is at the core of all religious exercise. And so there is ongoing litigation with this, and we did get some relief from the Supreme Court in the Roman Catholic Diocese and Rabbi Zwiebel's case, where the court pushed back on a lot of that and said, look, you do have these other places that are sometimes even non-essential that are being allowed more favorable gatherings than religious worship is. Unfortunately, as great as that was, and we're glad to see that, we're still seeing some lower courts ignore that. So just a few days ago, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals in California, with a couple of cases out there, said, well, look, we know what the Supreme Court said. We know that it's subject to strict scrutiny, so we really have to make sure the government has a really compelling interest and that what it's doing is narrowly tailored. But we think California's restrictions on in-person worship, we think it satisfies that. So sorry, churches, you're not going to be able to worship together. We know that grocery stores and some of these other places are allowed to continue to have their door open at 25, 30% capacity. But churches, what you do is just too dangerous. We're not going to allow you to meet. And I think this boils back to that rejection of the idea that religion is essential, that buying my bread is no different than going to get spiritual bread for our souls, and that the government has to respect that. And so I think although we have got some great victories, there's still a lot to be accomplished. And one of the ways that ADF and others are trying to do this is not only win battles in the court, but also look at legislative relief to see what can we do in state legislatures to put religion and religious worship and exercise where it properly belongs, which is not at some middle tier where as long as religion is in churches and houses of worship are being treated the same as big box stores or casinos, that's fine. But our Constitution elevates religion to a special place in our system. It is our First Amendment, our first freedom. And so our view is that, can the government have reasonable guidelines in place to protect public health? Sure. But whatever happens, religious organizations and the services they provide should always be at the very, very top tier. So if there is a single big box store open, if there's a single grocery store open, religious organizations ought to be able to open and to serve the needs of their congregations and communities as well. So we've put together a bill that we've worked with legislators called the Religion is Essential that does exactly that. It makes sure that whatever services and businesses are deemed essential, that churches and ministries are treated at least as good as those, if not better. So we're creating a solid floor that government can never put religious organizations' belief, but rather a jumping point so that they're always treated the best and can actually get greater freedoms to be able to minister to the needs of their congregations. So again, there's a lot to be done on this, but obviously we've made a lot of progress from the days where even drive-in services and virtual services were being restricted. But we cannot rest on this because at the end of the day, what religion does is essential. And I think the one thing that I always go back to, there was a statistic that came out talking about calls to a national suicide hotlines during April and sort of in the midst of when the pandemic. And I think the numbers were like a 900% increase of people dealing with depression and thoughts of suicide. That's exactly why we need churches, mosques, synagogues, and others, because there is, as Pastor Leist talked about, there is a spiritual battle going on in our nation as well. And it's something that no hospital can cure, no government official can cure, but only religion satisfies that hole. And I think we need to be cognizant of that, is that we cannot replace the vital role, the essential role that religion has in our American system.
Thank you, Matt. And there is no mistake in my mind that the reason we saw so much violence this summer, violence around the election, much of it has to do with the fact that people have not been worshiping God as we ought, that so many services were shut down, that so many people have had to watch services on their computers, which is not the same thing. It doesn't even pretend to be the same thing. It doesn't come close. I wrote an op-ed for the New York Post maybe 3 months ago because I was angry, and it was essentially, Governor Cuomo, don't you dare shut us down again, because I was in Whole Foods and it was so crowded. And when I go to Mass, there's no one near me. I think people who aren't necessarily sympathetic to the argument we're making that religion is essential, even during a pandemic, especially during a pandemic, they need to realize that we are abiding by standards. It's the outliers that we hear about on the news, people of faith presumably would want to be extra careful to protect their neighbor, right? And protect the gifts that we've been given by our Creator, most especially our lives. And so the reality on the ground is that people are being safe. And of course, I reading through the bill that you have at Alliance Defending Freedom, one thing that jumped out at me is a quote from one of the Fifth Circuit court case. Government does not have carte blanche, even in a pandemic, to pick and choose which First Amendment rights are open and which remain closed. And even beyond religious liberty, that is a really essential, critical point, as we have so many obviously polarized disagreements in this country, and those rights, our first freedom. If our first freedom is harmed, the rest of them are too. Rabbi, when did you get to the point where you realized you had to sue?
Well, what was particularly interesting was that there was a point in time when the synagogues were closed entirely. We couldn't even have 10 people. There was and when we reached the stage where things started easing, this goes back to, I guess, late spring of last year, and certainly early summer. By that time, things had started to ease considerably, and we thought that this pandemic was behind us. And even then, things started opening up, and the governor, in his great wisdom, decided to open up houses of worship also, but only 10 people. And again, no, if you were in a so-called red zone, and no consideration whatsoever as to how large the facility was. So we would have congregations that ordinarily would service hundreds of people, congregations affiliated with the Agudath Israel movement, who were in fact co-plaintiffs in this case with us. And they would traditionally have 300, 400 people for Sabbath services. And they were told only 10 could get in. Well, the 300 people wanted to get in, and 290 of them were told, sorry, you can't. That was just an impossible situation. So we decided at some point that although it was very far from our traditional means of operation, we don't like suing governors. We like to work with governors and try and behind the scenes accomplish what needs to be accomplished on behalf of the community. But in a situation like this, where we felt that this very core freedom of communal worship was being negated in such an irrational way, frankly, that really we felt we had no choice but to go to court. We actually suffered some setbacks at the earlier stages before we got to the United States Supreme Court. But happily, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled as it did, 5-4. And certainly we hope that will serve as a precedent as we move forward, not only in cases involving houses of worship, but all the other essential religious activities. Matt mentioned religious schooling, which is very essential to our community as well. And the fact that our schools had to be closed, distance learning just doesn't work quite the same as face-to-face classroom training. And that's true of all schools, and it's certainly true for our community in religious schools. So that's another context. You have yet another context of where government is deciding exactly what can be studied in religious schools, and insisting that a particular curriculum be followed that would turn the religious school into a reasonable facsimile of the neighboring public school. But that's not why religious schools are there. They're there to do certain other things. So again, recognizing that religious institutions do have a preferred right, as Matt said, that they certainly can't be treated less favorably than secular institutions under our Constitution. I think that that's essential, particularly, as I said before, in an era, in a climate where the movement more generally in the society around us has been toward greater secularization.
I have to say, in a New York context, I got chills the day that Governor Cuomo was talking about fewer deaths with COVID and said, God did not do this. We did this. This is very dangerous territory to be in. Matt, this legislation, what are your hopes for this? Are you seeing people on the state level wanting to take it up?
Yeah, we've seen a lot of legislators interested in this, because even in states that maybe have not been as restrictive, you've had a governor that's been more open and wanted to see religion in its proper place of highest priority. You still had local officials try and do this, cities and counties. And so I think there is a strong desire to put religion back in its proper place, and also recognizing the invaluable work that religion does. And so we've been able to talk with legislators all over the country asking about this, seeing what they can do. And so we do hope to see a lot of states enshrine some of these very vital protections for religious organizations into state law, with the goal that not only do we see that happen in these states, but that it also helps bolster what is happening in the litigation in other states where this may not be able to pass, because we really see it as a both-and solution. Continue to litigate, continue to stand with houses of worship that are fighting for this in places like New York and California, but then to see other states where they say, you know what, we want to write these protections into law, and we want to make sure that all of our religious organizations never have the day where they're told, shut your doors, turn off the lights, don't welcome anyone in. Because the thing that always troubles me is the idea of, we would all be appalled if their family is starving and they're trying to get into a grocery store and the government comes in and says, sorry, you can't come in. And from our perspective, someone that's longing for spiritual nourishment, that's saying, I need to have an interaction with God, I need to have fellowship, I need to have my soul sustained and nourished, I never want to see them walk up to the doors of their house of worship and find them shut by a government official.
Well, I'll also add that in New York and many other states, abortion clinics were allowed to stay open when the churches weren't allowed to stay open. It's just unconscionable. Rabbi, you talked a little bit about the suffering that people in your world really experienced because the synagogues were closed. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because as Matt mentioned, we know suicide rates have gone up. I can't imagine what it's like for a person right now facing mortality of so much insecurity, to not have some faith to help them through. And for people of faith, it was really hard, and continues to be. So what has been some of the experience of your people?
Well, people can connect to their Creator whether they're alone in their room and without anybody else surrounding them, or they're part of a large congregation. There's no question that prayer is essential, and prayer is something, and it's healing, and it has so many positive values. And of course, while our synagogues and other houses of worship were closed entirely, then people would pray from their homes, and under Orthodox Jewish tenets, they are required to pray 3 times a day, and on the Sabbath, special prayer services are offered, and holidays, and so on. So this was going on even with the closing of the synagogues. But communal worship occupies a very special place, because when you get together with other members of the community, and you are joined together and as part of a congregation, then you think about your own needs when you pray, but you also think about those of your neighbors, your fellow human beings who are there with you, and you form part of this communal outreach to the Holy One. to focus on what is so important to us. So communal prayer is a level above, and it's, again, as the district court said, well, you can continue to practice your religion just with adjustments. Adjustments means not in synagogue, not in your house of worship, in your own room. Great, we will. And we do, and it's valuable. It's extraordinarily valuable, but it still is missing that extra added dimension of communal prayer being part of a congregation. And this is what we had to fight for.
Additionally, I just want to add, in a Catholic context, there are a number of priests and religious and some others pray the liturgy of the hours, which is heavily psalms, and so that continues to happen, and people were praying with the virtual, but as you say, the communal is so important and really essential. And in a Catholic context, we believe at Mass that Jesus is physically present. I'm not asking everyone to believe that, but if you believe that, oh my goodness, of course this would be a rupture, as with not having any of your communal service would be, and it's an unnecessary one, as we've discussed. Matt, there's this, as we mentioned before, there's this dangerous trend that's happening here, where sort of, if the powers that be decide that something is unessential, or something is, some traditional views are not acceptable anymore, even though they were widely acceptable almost yesterday. We can think of a Democratic president ago who had some views that are now not really allowed, right? Matt, are you seeing anything that gives you hope in terms of at least the law, but hopefully other people understanding, and maybe some of the ministers of various congregations who are coming to you, them stepping up? Does that help? I think of the Little Sisters of the Poor having to go to the Supreme Court twice. I hope that makes other people realize that there's a danger here. There's a risk here for the First Amendment.
Yeah, absolutely. And I am encouraged for a couple of reasons. So number one, you talked about religious organizations, pastors, synagogues, others stepping up, and we have seen that. I think the COVID, among other things, has shown a lot of churches and ministries and religious organizations how vulnerable they are to the government coming in very quickly and being able to shut down their ability to gather together. Something that we probably took for granted for hundreds of years, and have forgotten that just how quickly the government can do that. And so I have been emboldened to see how many pastors have been speaking out to say, look, we want to keep our congregation safe, and we're going to adopt good, reasonable safety guidelines for our congregation. But what we can't do is forsake that gathering together that is vital to what we do. And so I am encouraged about that. The other thing is we are seeing some really good court outcomes, obviously most notably with the Supreme Court's decision in Roman Catholic Diocese, and to see them really start pushing back against state efforts and putting clear limits to say you can't treat religious organizations in houses of worship worse than their secular counterparts. And this is, I think, part of a broader thing. We saw recent court decisions in Trinity Lutheran and Espinoza. These were cases dealing with to what extent can religious organizations participate in government programs, government grants, school choice, and not be discriminated against because of their religious identity, and saw some very strong rulings in both of those. So I think between a court that is much more protective of religious exercise in our First Amendment than it has been in many years, coupled with religious organizations that are more willing to step up and say our rights are important, the work we do is important, and being able to articulate that and willing to, if necessary, litigate, but even to show up and testify on bills to get civically involved to defend those rights. I think we are in a stronger place than we've ever been, but obviously there are going to be more challenges ahead in a lot of different ways, and I think we can't ever just step back and say the work is done. I think vigilance is the price of liberty, and we have to continue to fight these battles and stand for religious freedom in every place it pops up.
Rabbi, I find it a little alarming that it was a 5-4 decision. What about the cultural element of this, where, as you were saying earlier, there's a real secularist streak in our culture, and even among people of faith, there's a certain amount of blending in that happens, maybe inevitably if we're not vigilant, right? How would you like to see us address that better?
Well, those are challenges for faith communities. Those are challenges for individuals, for parents, as they raise their children, and try to convey to their children the centrality of God in their lives and in everybody's life. I think that's where the real challenges are, we have to win these battles household by household. Because the culture is a very frightening thing, especially, with the ease of accessing anything and everything through the internet today. That's something which again creates challenge for our communities as they struggle to retain the values with which they were raised, and to pass that on to the next generation of their children. So I think that these battles can be discussed at organizational levels and at communal levels, but at the same time, the real battle is right there in your own, around your dining room table. When you get together for a family meal, what do you talk about? How do you talk about it? Do you mention God? How meaningful is it to recite grace and to express appreciation for God's hand in your daily life? I think that's where the battles really are taking place. And I just wanted to add one point to the question that you asked earlier that Matt spoke about in terms of looking at things that are encouraging, signs that are encouraging. We were very moved by the level, the number of different communities and groups and organizations that, through amicus curiae, friend of the court briefs, in our case, expressed their solidarity with us. And so we had the Brooklyn diocese as filing their own case. Agudath Israel representing Orthodox Jews. We had a Muslim group that came in and put in an amicus brief, and one or two other faith groups as well. And it was a beautiful manifestation, I think, of a sense of coming together by the different faith communities, recognizing that in solidarity we are strong, and our clout politically and legally is enhanced. And I think that is looking for encouraging signs and where we might see greater progress in the months and years ahead is this fostering of a greater solidarity among religious communities.
I think it's really a witness to what pluralism is. I think we've lost sight of what that is, and by you stepping up, that is a great educational opportunity, among other things. And I couldn't agree more on the family. It's the most important thing, and it's also why the places of worship need to stay open, because families need resources, parents need resources. And of course, so many churches, we didn't even get into this, so many churches and synagogues and mosques and provide services. This is the best of civil society that comes out of places of worship. And so we're meeting physical and mental needs as well as spiritual needs. So with that, thank you for those words of hope. And again, I can go to Mass in New York because of you, so thank you. And I want to bring back Emily.
We'll send you a bill.
Well, thank you so much, Rabbi and Pastor and Matt and Kathryn, for your very insightful comments on why religion is essential and the need to be vigilant in protecting religious liberty, a responsibility for all Americans. It was a delight to hear from each one of you. And if you work on the Hill think tank or just have questions, please feel free to contact me at the information that is on the screen. And if you would like to learn more about future events at Heritage, please check our website, heritage.org/events. Thank you so much for joining us today.